let's do some texture mapping. Let's do some rendering. We've got our blue chair that we worked on earlier, and I've just used the default colours which are available over here. It's part of the modifier, and we've just changed those solid colours for the entire object. Keep in mind you can also name your object by changing them there, or you can change them in the stack where you've got their names by right-clicking and rename. But I tend to just do them over here. So if that were to be the seat, call it seat. Easier to find on your list when you're looking through them. But so far we've dealt with colours by changing it there. Materials offer a lot more power. There's a confusion between what is a material and what is a texture. A material is what you apply to your object. A texture is a type of material. That'll make more sense the more we experiment with it. But I'm going to go back to just my blue colour that I had earlier. Well, let me go that far back, never mind. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, just like our reference photo here, we're going to be quite a bright blue, quite a matte blue for the seat and for the backrest, but quite a shiny grey plastic, closer to black, but ultimately grey plastic is going to be there for everything else. I don't mind too much about the little textures and the writing that we're going to have on our handles. I'm just going to set it all to solid black. If it's not seat, I'm going to do solid black. Now we have a problem because the seat is all one piece and the backrest is all one piece. So we need to make sub-selections out of that object before we apply a material to it. Now I'm not going to be applying a texture. I'm not going to use a photograph, and I'm not going to apply a photograph. I'm just going to use materials. Materials, remember this icon here, the material editor in 3ds Max version 15. It will be the 4th icon from the right. You'll have fewer teapots than me, but I get more teapots because I'm using 2016 version. You'll open the material editor, and as I've said in lesson, you get the slate material editor, which is intimidating and I don't fully understand, so I always click on modes and go back to the compact material editor. You're more than welcome to use the slate material editor if other tutorials ask you to use that. It does exactly the same thing, I'm just used to this one. Remember, each one of these slots here represents your painter's palette. You can ready a material and then you can drag and drop that and reuse that and get rid of it and reapply it. It's just a dumping ground for materials while you work on them. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our blue material and we're going to create our grey black shiny material for the plastic. I'm just going to click on this one here. You can click on any of them, doesn't matter. Like I say, they're just temporary dumping grounds. You can also name them if you want to. I'm going to change the diffuse colour for this. Diffuse, remember, this means the block colour of an object, how light will diffuse or interact with it. So you click on the little bit that by default is grey, choose your colour that you like. I'm going to go for a rich blue there-ish. I could totally use the ink dropper. How clever can I be? Not that clever, that's a shame, but I could easily get that colour if I wanted to. Pull it into Photoshop, pull it into Paint, just use the ink dropper tool to get the RGB values, red, green, blue values if I wanted to be absolutely precise about it, but I'm just going to use that blue. I'm also going to set up, using the same trick in the next one, something very close to black, almost black. I've just got 888 RGB, very, very dark indeed. What I'm going to do with this one though is I'm going to modify its specularity. Specularity, if I take a sacrificial teapot as an example, is how shiny something is. So I've just dragged and dropped that black material onto our sacrificial teapot. If I change the specularity, watch what it does to the teapot. You see how that suddenly went shiny? So if I turn it off, shiny, shiny. You can also double click on these materials and you can resize them to get a feel for what they would look on a sphere. You can change that to see what it would look like on a cube, what it would look like on a cylinder, or what it would look like on a sphere, just with that button there. But we can see that gives it a shine. If I rotate around it, that shine will follow us around. It's how it's going to interact with the lighting in our scene. We can change the specularity or the specular level. We can also reduce or increase the glossiness. Glossiness refers to how narrow the shine is. So a low glossiness is a high area of shine, whereas a very high glossiness is a very narrow point of shine. And you can soften that and you can play with these values to see what they do. What I'm going to do is give it a okay amount of glossiness, about 35, and a specularity of about 50. I just want this to be shiny when compared to the matte of this one, which is going to have no shininess at all. No specularity, no glossiness, but I don't think it will do anything because there's no specularity at all involved. Thank you, teapot. Away you go. What I need to do here is I need to select the key components of these objects. Really easily, I'm going to select everything that's not padded. So this is going to be easy. I've put a floor in my scene. You don't need to do so in yours. I'm going to select everything in my scene with the exception of the floor. So I'm holding down Alt and I've just drag selected over the floor. I don't want the backrest. I don't want the seat. Sometimes it is way easier to select the bits that are going to be. You see that's also called the back there that's joining the two together. Sometimes it's easier to select the majority and then remove the minority. Remember, selection is 9/10 of the battle. I've mentioned that before. Now with that selection made, I can just drag and drop onto any single part of that selection, and it will ask, do I assign to the object I've dropped it on, or the selection I've currently got, and I do want the selection. That will apply to everything. So far, so good. Again, because I've got edged faces switched on, you can see the edges. If I turn it off, suddenly we don't, and we get a much more appropriate representation of what the graphic will look like when we render it. Next stage is I want to take the back and I want to take the seat, and I'm going to say apply to the black to the minority of the object, apply the blue to the majority, and this applies, and this works in exactly the same way we just did. Take your texture or the material that's going to apply to the majority and apply it to the whole object. What we then do is add a modifier to that, and we're going to use the modifier of edit mesh. This is the one time that edit poly doesn't work for us. We need edit mesh for making a subselection to apply textures to. I'm going to go to polygon mode, and I'm going to do this in the front view, which is just so I've got a side view of it. What I want to do here is making sure I use the select object tool rather than the select and move tool, just the select one which is there, select object. I want to select all of the polys that I want, so I'm going to have to do control to make these selections. Notice that if I miss a bit, I just need to tap into it, just need to enter into the selection. And again, I'm eyeballing this because through experience, I can work out that this lump here, if I follow it down, that's going to be the large plastic back piece. So I'm just going to follow that. Remember, you sometimes may be easier to do a touch too much and then use Alt to remove the bits you don't want. Just make sure you do drag selections to remove all of those. Before you do anything, I recommend having a look in perspective view to make sure you haven't clicked on anything you shouldn't, and that's all good. What you can then do is using your material editor, drag and drop the new plastic part onto that, and that has just done. I'm going to turn off polygon mode, and there we go, that's now applied only to that subselection of that object, and it's starting to look far better. Going to do the same trick now, control, hang on a second, edit mesh. Again, I'm going to look at this from a different perspective. I'm going to look at this from the front view. Select the parts that I know that I need. I need all of that. I also need all of that. I also need all of that. I need all of that. And I need all of that. I don't need you. So there we go. Again, just double checking and having a quick whip around to make sure you haven't selected anything you shouldn't. And then same trick again. Drag, drop, it's applied. And our chair should look an awful lot nicer. What we can now do is look at those values through the renderer and see, does it look any good? I've already put a light in my scene, but I'm going to delete it so we can reapply that lighting. I'm going to take a save at this point as well. On the Create panel, we don't want geometry, we don't want lines, we want lights. Because we're going to be using the default scanline renderer rather than the more advanced mental ray renderer for this, we don't want photometric lights, we just want standard lights. I want an omnidirectional light, which means points in all directions. I'm going to put that in my scene. By default, it will make it on the floor in the same way every other object is made. It's going to pull it up on the x-axis. And again, using multiple views, position it where you want it. I'm quite partial to something kind of at 45 degrees from the object. Or the way I kind of try and do is 45 degrees that angle and 45 degrees that angle. I think it looks good. Always, 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 if at all possible, on the modifier panel, turn shadows on for your light, and that will make a world of difference. Off, on, and then we're going to render this out. To do a test render, you should be able just to click the render production, which for you guys should be the teapot on the furthest right. If you've done any rendering so far, it may have changed the settings. So if you want to go back and alter those settings, it's render setup, which is the one by material editor, or the teapot with the little box in front of it, the little options box. You want to make sure you're rendering just a single frame and you're not saving it out. By default, this should be as it's set. It also defaults to 640 by 480 resolution, which is more than enough for testing. In my version in 2016, the render button is at the top. For you guys, you'll scroll down, it will be at the bottom. There'll be a big button for render. And it will render out. And you can see, depending on where you position your virtual camera, so your viewport, you can see what it comes out. Once you've set your settings up, you can do the shortcut of just clicking Render Production, which will be the teapot the furthest on the right. And that looks okay, but you see how the shadows look really rough, really raggedy. And that doesn't look very good. So we're going to change the type of shadow map. So with our Omni selected again, if it's deselected, just click on it. I don't want shadow map because it's a bit cheap and cheerful. I'm going to use ray traced shadows. And now we're going to see when we render it, does that make a difference? That's much crisper. Very crisp, perhaps too crisp. Let's see what happens if we use advanced ray trace shadows. Still very crisp. I'm going to go and try area shadows. I'm just going to try different shaders. That doesn't look very good. I'm going to go back to ray trace shadows. Now what I want to do here, because I want to soften those shadows, it looks very harsh, very hard at the moment. And if I end up looking from this perspective of my chair, it will be completely in the dark because there's no illumination being cast from this position. So what I would recommend is have one primary light in your scene, and we're going to change the intensity, color, or attenuation. Intensity, color, attenuation, this tab here. I'm going to drop this down so it's a little bit less bright, 0.9. I'm going to make a clone of it and drag it to the opposite side. I do want a copy, I don't want an instance, I just want a regular copy. And I'm going to have this be very dim, perhaps 0.05, quite dim indeed. This will give some illumination behind my chair. So you see that's the one that's on full brightness or very close to full brightness. That's the one's a little dimmer. Don't forget, the closer you put an object, the brighter it will be. So now if I look at the back of this chair, it should be visible, but obviously in shadow, which is what we see. And that's kind of softened these shadows off nicely, and I really like the detail that's giving on the hose detail on the floor down there. That looks really, really nice. Shadows make a world of difference. They kind of are the difference between PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 era graphics in reality. It wasn't really to do with an increase of polys, though that did help. It was what you could do with dynamic lights. So that looks a lot better when compared to the original one. Perhaps there's a little bit too much shine or not enough shine. So if I zoom in and have a look at that, if you find that middle mouse zooms in too much, you can use the magnifier tool over here to zoom in more specifically. So if I have a look at how that looks, I've got quite a nice bit of shine, so not over the top. I am slightly hovering off the floor, and that's something that becomes apparent when you start using shadows, because if you are hovering, it becomes really obvious. It looks very plasticky over here, which is kind of the look I'm going for. So yeah, I'm happy with that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to very, very quickly do a test render of spinning around this object. A few different ways of doing this. All I'm going to do is set up a very quick camera, and we're going to have it spin round. The way you do this, position your camera where you want it to start being. So I kind of, again, I like 45 degrees. I think that looks pretty nice. Perhaps I'm going to try the side. I don't like square on. So a bit of an angle, I quite like that. Be aware, the resolution of your viewport may well be different to the resolution you render it out at. So you can just about see on my viewport there's not a lot of gap between the top of the viewport and the top of the chair, whereas when I render it out, because 800 by 600 is a 4 by 3 aspect ratio, whereas this is close to 16 by 9 aspect ratio, I get a different output. So if you've got an appreciation of aspect ratios, now's the time to put that into practice. So I'm going to zoom in. Doesn't look great in the viewport, but when I do a test render, it fills the scene more appropriately, fills the camera more appropriately. That's a little bit too close. There we go, that's better. I tend to take a save at this point. Control and C will create a camera. You'll notice that it's now gone to camera 1. Mine's gone PHYS camera 1, kind of a physics camera. However, yours will just say camera 1, which is perfect. It makes life a little bit easier for you, actually. It's also a targeted camera. So I'm now looking through the eyes of this new camera that I've created. It comes with a target, and it comes with the camera itself. I can click on the target, go to the move tool, and I can move the target around even though I'm looking through the camera. This is like being led by your nose. You can also press P to change your view back to perspective view. You can rotate around and you can see where the perspective, where the target is actually looking. You can see it's not where we thought. We thought it was looking at the chair. In reality, it's not. And in your different viewports, you can see that as well. I'm just going to position the target so it's smack bang on my chair. And then I'm going to press C to jump back to my camera view. Notice I didn't need a control and C, just C. P for perspective, C for camera. P for perspective, C for camera. Or you can just click on perspective or the view and you can change it to whatever you like. You can have multiple cameras in your scene, by the way. You don't just have to have one, and you can jump between them. I'm just going to line that up so I'm happy with it. I think about that looks good. So far, so good. In the top view, I'm now going to create a circle. This circle isn't going to be geometry. So I've gone to lines, gone to shapes, and circle. What I want to do to make this circle is I'm going to start on the inside where my object is, where my chair is, and we're going to go all the way out until it reaches, I'll do it this way, till it reaches where my camera is, just about halfway through. This is going to be the path I'm going to use for my camera to follow. It's like a track. I'm then going to move it up in the left viewport or the front viewport, doesn't matter. I've just changed this back to front. As long as it's about, again, roughly half. So the line is roughly half, the height is roughly half of your camera. Select your camera, making sure you don't double click it. If you double click on it, it may select the camera and the target. We don't want the target, we just want the camera. The next step is we're going to slave that camera to the path, to this circle we've just created. So I've clicked on camera, animation, constraints, path constraints. So that's animation, constraints, path constraint. It will then ask, depending on which viewport is currently active, give you a little dotted line and say, well, which path do you want me to follow? Click on your circle, and it will now follow that path. It will also always snap to the right-hand side. There's a good reason for that. I couldn't tell you what it is, but I do know there's a good reason. It will also take you to the motion panel. So even if you were on Create before, it will snap you to the motion panel. It will also, because you're looking at the right-hand side, it will be square onto your object. I don't like square on. I always like starting and finishing at dodgy angles. So you can scroll down and change the percentage along path from 0 to wherever you want it. And you see how it's now traversing around your circle. You don't have to just use a circle for this. You can use any shape. So you can arcs, you can have it follow a line of text, you can have it follow an ellipse. Helixes are quite good. If you don't know what a helix is, it looks like that. So you can have things spiral around something. A lot of control. And what will happen is if you scroll your scroller bar, it will now do over 100 frames, a 360-degree rotation. This can be quite quick. So you can change it. For now, we're just going to keep the defaults. Now what I want to do is use render setup, and I don't want to render a single frame, I now want to render a range of frames. You can also click active time segment because that's how long our animation is for. You can change the resolution if you want. You can set it to HD if you really want to, but for our assignments I'm more than happy to accept 640 by 480. It's not a problem. Carry on scrolling down. You want to save the file. You need to click Files and say where you want to save it to. Universally, I recommend the desktop because if you're rendering at home or you're rendering on the college machines and you run out of storage space, the render will fail and crash spectacularly. So if you dump it on the desktop and then transfer it once you're happy, that's a much better way of doing it. Now, I recommend the file type being AVI. I am really open for suggestions on this one because AVI gives you a really heavily compressed file. So if you guys can find better ways of doing this, I genuinely am all ears, and I've left the comment section open for your input if you find a better way. So I'm going to use AVI file for that, give it an appropriate name. I've already done one. I'm going to call mine chair output 2 and save it. Remember, render for you will be down the bottom right hand corner, or you can now use the render production button up there, but I'm going to click render and it will now do frame by frame. In this case, it's going to take 40 seconds. I think a crafty edit is called for. So that's the rendering complete, that's finished, all 100 frames. It does line by line, the line scans down, that's why it's called scan line rendering. I'm going to look at my desktop for chair output 2, which is just created, and if I look at that, I can see that over 100 frames, that looks quite nice. I get a 360-degree spin, and I can just, using the software that I'm using, see that and replay it. If I compare that, if I side by side that with my original one before it was texture map and before it had any shading, these are the same settings but with just one light, and it really does make a world of difference adding that material. Sorry if I called it texture map, it was a material. So again, if I just compare it with this, which I'll put on the end of the video, you can see quite a nice effect.